This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Daniel O'Brien, K-State grain economist, kicks off today's show with a grain market update as he reviews the recent USDA acreage and grain stocks reports. Continuing the show is part of a webinar on New World Screwworm, where Erin Petro from the Kansas Department of Health and Environment discusses the human aspect of the pest. K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan ends the show explaining when tomato plants should be fertilized during the season for healthy tomato plant growth with maximum yield. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show with a grain market update, as we will not have a show on Friday, July 3rd because of 4th of July. And in for this grain market update, we have K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
Daniel, on June 30th, we got a USDA acreage report and a USDA grain stocks report. And what are some key points you saw from them?
Well, it's a market shortened week. Of course, the markets by 11 o'clock on Tuesday had this information in hand. So there's a lot of question as to what would be occurring as a response. And the first 2 days out were pretty positive. For the first day, which is kind of a barometer of where the markets would go, you saw a move higher on Tuesday's closes for corn by 10 cents for the lead contract. Well, July now in delivery, I guess you call September lead contract, that was up 6.5. D's corn was up 6.5, down up to 436.5. November soybeans were up about 4.5 cents, as were the August lead. So November by 11.43. The September hard red winter wheat contract up about 8 or so. And then the next day came in, and you thought, well, is it a one-day wonder, or is there enough positive there with combination with other news to keep moving? Came up on July the 1st, September up another 6 cents, D's up another 6.25, up to 442 and a quarter. So those are not glory days numbers, where the market really jumped to the higher side. Soybeans were up again August, about up 9 cents. November beans up 5.5, up to 11.49.5. So 11, you get around 450 corn, about 11.5 soybeans. Then we're getting to where we thought we really don't know what's going on. We kind of hang out there. Those are important psychological reference prices, I guess you'd call it. And then hard red winter wheat also on the second day after somewhat of a run up. The first day came in again up with of course July wheat and you're in delivery up 12.25 and September up 9.75. So some positive news. I think when you stand back and look at what the market from this report probably was responding to, we were looking at the quarterly stocks numbers for corn, came in at 5.295 billion bushels, which was down by over 100 million bushels from what had been estimated coming into the report at about 5.408. So, and actually was about 500,000, there you go, 5,000 bushels less than the lower end of the trade range. So a lower than expected number. So what does that mean when it comes in? That means either there's something happening in the usage numbers that are indicate more usage than we had thought, and that's the first place you'd look would be probably the feed use holding up decently. So it's either that or it's a accumulating evidence issue of maybe perhaps last year's crop may have been slightly overestimated by 100 or so million bushels. So you have either of those questions on the table. We'll find out more about that as we get to here we just had the June quarterly stocks report. We get to the September stocks report. That's when you start seeing past year's adjustments show up. If that happens, probably look to some adjustment in yield, but it's really premature to jump on that. But here we're starting to show lower stocks than we expected, and it starts to raise that question. And still, just about 5.295 billion bushels of stocks on June 1. We were at 4.64 last year. So still higher stocks, just less. if all else carried through, just with that, with USDA's most recent estimates for May, you'd be taking ending stocks instead of 1.8 some billion bushels down to 1.7. And that's, again, you're getting closer to again, the reference point in the market, about 1.5 billions, tightening up stocks to use more, and then you'd see where things go. So see where that's at. The planting side for the corn equation, again, came in at an estimate of 95.34 million acres planted, and that was about 350,000 more acres than had been estimated. Still down from last year. Last year we were at final number 98.8 million acres, so down about 3.4, 3.5 from last year's start. So here you got that number with really most of the shouting to be done in that market still coming in July, August, September. So we'll see where that goes. The soybean number really didn't change much. Came in at 85.365 million acres, just slightly lower than the pre-report estimate, but still 4 million acres plus higher than last year. So that's the trade-off. We have more soybean acres, less corn acres, and now we're just figuring out how we're going to land to get to the final number. Really, on the acreage side, what was a surprise in this report had to do with the wheat numbers. Of course, the all wheat numbers in the U.S. were down about 1.1 million acres for plantings, and that was below the lower end of the range. So then you start looking at the class, see where to come from, and the winter wheat planted acres figure came in at 31.52 million acres, and that was 900,000 acres less than had been in. Than we or the industry anticipate coming into the market. And the lower end of the trading range before that number landed was 32.1. So here we came in at 31.5. So pretty big deal. Pretty big deal, providing some support for the wheat market. And that number at 31.5, down from 33.1, 33.2, down about 1.6 million acres from last year. So if you're looking at the wheat markets, we've got a declining production base, and we have a pretty good idea what the crop is, or at least we're gaining that right now for the hard red side. So it just ups the ante for the next WASDE report coming here in July. I think it's the 10th or the 11th, thereabouts. So we'll see how these numbers translate as we come to those WASDE reports. Right now, no doubt when the WASDE reports come out, they'll take these acreage numbers, plug them straight in without any adjustment. So again, not a lot of change for planted acres, and the yield number will be unchanged. As I think we'd be pretty confident of that. The USDA can change that, but they won't have any survey data until August, so they'll probably wait for that. But then they'll go to the usage side of the balance sheets for corn, and since they're probably loath to change anything on crop size from last year, probably make an adjustment, I would guess, off into the usage side, and probably go to the residual side of that. That's where I think they go first. So we'll see where that goes. And I would say there's some other changes, and then they probably led to these changes in the major crops. Cotton number came in at 9.85 million acres, up 214,000 acres from before, and also up from last year about 570,000 acres. So it bears looking at the state level numbers for where this came from. We'll have to look at the Kansas numbers in future reports. Sorghum acres were up a little bit from expectations, still down from last year, about 360,000, but up about 4,650 from what we had been expecting. So that's positive for the sorghum industry, folks. Barley up, oats up. We don't grow much rice in Kansas, although with the rain we've been getting the last week or so in western part of the state, some people are probably jokingly wondering if we should. But the national rice number came in at 2.017 million acres, and that was below the lower end of the trading range at 2.2, and from last year it was 2.8. So we're not big into rice here in Kansas, but I'm sure places where they do grow quite a bit of rice, they're wondering about that pretty dramatic acreage reduction, which is almost, it's about 25-30% acreage being lower. Preliminary estimates really for exports, still corn exports for the week ending June 25th at about, at least the preliminary numbers showing about 70.3 million bushels, need a pace of about 61.5 to meet the USDA's projection. So that's going strong. When they start looking at that balance sheet, they're probably not going to cut back the corn export number. And from what I've seen on ethanol usage, it's holding up pretty decently too. So they're kind of forced to either go to wet corn milling or feed usage. That's about where they got to go. Sorghum exports, again, sorghum's just been choppy up and down on a weekly basis. Preliminarily, about 6.7 million bushels for the week ending the 25th. The need a pace about 4.9 to meet the USDA's projection. So that's a positive. Also, I guess we're looking for positives for Kansas crops. And for wheat, hard red winter wheat exports about 5.6 million, not a bad week. We need about 6.25 meet the USDA's projections. So in the ballpark. And for soybeans, really the preliminary numbers just almost dead on the pace that we have right now, which is, I think, for exports aiming at about 1.51 billion bushels. And if anything, what we hear more so, and it'd be really interesting to see what comes out of that this coming USDA report, is soybean crush staying pretty strong. So I guess with that, we're in the mode and asking ourselves the question. So with these type of report numbers and these expectations, have we seen our lows for the year going forward? So we're asking that question the first week in July. So that's the issue. So what we're doing, we're discounting weather risk because we're already wondering if we're doing what the USDA does in their projections. They plug in normal conditions all the way to the end. So that's where we're at right now, but it just sets the stage really to come in and see what the USDA does in that upcoming July WASDE report.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby. Take care.
That was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with part of the recent New World Screwworm webinar, where we hear from State Public Health Veterinarian of the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, Erin Petro, as she shares some thoughts on a more human aspect of New World Screwworm.
The adult flies aren't going to be the focus of our presentation today, though. We're going to talk about their larvae. And when the larvae infest a person or animal, this is called myiasis. And the important feature of this type of myiasis, as you've heard about, is that the larvae feed on living tissue, which is very unlike our other maggots. And because they are actively feeding on living tissue, infestation can cause serious tissue damage that can lead to secondary bacterial infections and death, both in infected animals and people. Through a vast elimination campaign, this parasite was eradicated from the U.S. in 1966 through the use of sterile insect technique, animal movements, and quarantines, much of the same efforts that we're seeing today trying to re-eliminate this pest. It was further pushed south, and eventually a biological barrier was established at the Darien Gap in Panama. So over the past 4 years, we've seen a slow breakdown in that previously established biological barrier. And it really started in August of 2022, so almost 4 years ago, with an outbreak in Panama. The following year, cases in Panama exploded from an average of about 25 cases per year to more than 6,500. And outbreaks of New World Screwworm started being reported from countries from Panama northward. So almost a year later, we saw an outbreak in Costa Rica. 8 months later, cases were reported out of Nicaragua. And then in the fall, things really took off, with Honduras having an outbreak in September, Guatemala in October, Mexico in November, and then finally El Salvador and Belize in December of 2024. So as you all are aware by now, New World Screwworm has been detected in the United States, and this was first reported on a cattle ranch in La Pryor, Texas on June 3rd. This represented the first case of New World Screwworm in an animal in the U.S. since 2017, when there was an outbreak of New World Screwworm in the Florida Keys. Before that, as I mentioned, it was eradicated in 1966. So this was a really major finding for the animal health industry, which again had been preparing for an incursion over the past several years as cases moved closer to the southern border. So, in response, animal health officials are conducting robust animal surveillance, wildlife surveillance, and fly trapping along that Texas-Mexico border and around those cases that have been identified in Texas. Additionally, sterile flies are being released in Texas and actually were being released prior to that case to really try to help stall the northward expansion of the fly. So, with the resurgence of New World screwworm, we've seen several thousand cases in humans. As of June 22nd, which is the latest that we have data available, there had been over 2,000 cases reported in humans from Mexico and Central America. And this is cumulative from the start of the outbreak. We also saw one travel-associated case of New World screwworm. This was in a Maryland resident about a year ago in August. This was a resident who had recently traveled from an outbreak area in Central America, and this was important because it represented the first case of New World screwworm detected in the United States that was associated with travel to an outbreak area. Now, it's not really something new per se. In previous years, we do have occasional travelers return from screwworm endemic countries like the Dominican Republic with New World screwworm myiasis. So it's something that happens occasionally, but again, this one was kind of important because it was the first associated with the current outbreak. So we'll discuss what New World screwworm looks like in humans. And so as we mentioned, New World screwworm is an obligate parasite. It feeds there on healthy living tissue. And I really think that that is an important point to reiterate because humans are also affected with facultative myiasis, which is the feeding of larvae on dead tissue. And in fact, facultative myiasis is much more common in the US. We see, again, a handful of those cases every year, not uncommon. We've seen a couple in Kansas already this year. Clinically, a New World screwworm myiasis is characterized by visible larvae on open wounds or the mucous membranes of the eyes, nose, mouth, and other body orifices. You also want to be sure to check the ears, especially if there's a history of otitis. So with New World screwworm, the wounds tend to be rapidly progressive and painful because that larvae is eating deeper into the flesh. Often there is a foul odor, bloody discharge, and swelling around the lesion. Patients may report the sensation of movement in wounds or body orifices. And because these larvae feed on live tissue and burrow deep into the wounds, they can cause extensive tissue damage, which may result in secondary bacterial infections and even systemic illness. When we think about the risk factors for New World screwworm myiasis in humans, it really hinges around the behavior of the fly because they're attracted to those open wounds of the mucous membranes to lay their eggs. So the first risk factor is going to be open sores or wounds. And these can be really small wounds, including scratches, insect bites, and recent surgical sites. Another risk factor is medical conditions that can cause bleeding or open sores, such as with chronic skin conditions like eczema and cancer of the skin or mucous membrane tissues, such as sinus cancer. This is a large ulcer that's been infested with New World screwworm larvae. There are many, many larvae there in the wound that you can see just really invading that ulcer of the person. Individuals that spend a lot of time outdoors are also at an increased risk of infestation. So we think about there with occupational risks like we see with farmers or livestock workers, and also people experiencing homelessness and others that may sleep outdoors. And then finally, we see an increased disease burden in those that are physically or mentally incapacitated and are unable to care for themselves and may be unable to keep flies away from themselves. When it comes to diagnosis of New World screwworm, this is what we call a 4-hour reportable disease in humans, meaning that upon suspicion, healthcare providers should immediately call KDHE on our 24/7 epidemiology hotline. Diagnosis is through identification of the larvae. So KDHE is able to facilitate this diagnosis through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And our preference really is telediagnosis through those high quality images so that we can have a rapid answer and start our public health response immediately. So we ask healthcare providers to save at least 10 larvae in a separate container for identification. And importantly, all larvae need to be removed from the wound and placed in 70% ethanol, which will both preserve them for identification and kill them. Treatment of New World screwworm really is pretty straightforward. The mainstay of treatment is to remove and kill all visible larvae and eggs in the patient. It's also very important to properly dispose of these larvae, again, by placing them in ethanol in a leak-proof container, putting that container in a bag, and then disposing of that. The important thing is to not throw them away because, as we know, if we throw these larvae away, they can pupate in the environment, mature into adult flies, and then we can have an established population here in Kansas, which we really do not want to have. You also want to make sure to closely inspect linens and patient clothing or belongings for any maggots that may have fallen off of the wound. Because of the severity of these lesions and the tissue destruction, we want to make sure to monitor for any secondary bacterial infections so that those can be treated if they occur. So I will wrap up with some prevention tips. First, you want to start with keeping all wounds clean and covered, no matter how small they are or where on the body they may occur. Next, you'll want to prevent insect bites, especially when traveling to these endemic tropical areas. And this will not only help prevent New World screwworm myiasis because you won't be getting those small wounds, but just as importantly, it will also protect you from vector-borne diseases while traveling. I cannot miss an opportunity to harp on the prevention of vector-borne diseases. So you can prevent insect bites by wearing loose-fitting, long-sleeved shirts and pants, applying an EPA-registered insect repellent to any exposed skin, treating clothing and gear with 0.5% permethrin, and sleeping indoors or in rooms with screens whenever possible. If you are sleeping outdoors, using a bed net or sleeping in a screened-in tent will also add a layer of protection. So for our healthcare providers that may be listening today or reviewing these slides, I have a couple of key points that I wanted to leave you with. First is knowing when New World screwworm should be on your differential. Now remember that this parasite is not currently present in Kansas, so getting a good travel history is really important. If they have visible larvae in the wound or mucous membranes, and especially that destruction of healthy tissue, you really want to be thinking about New World screwworm. Remember that there are many morphologically similar species of flies that can cause myiasis, so submitting those larvae for confirmatory identification is really crucial. Early recognition and proper treatment and disposal are really critical. So we ask that healthcare providers report suspect cases of New World screwworm myiasis to the Kansas Department of Health and Environment immediately. Again, we have that 24/7 epidemiology hotline where we have trained our epidemiologists to be able to take these calls and histories so that we can start that public health response as soon as possible.
Once again, that was Erin Petro, who's the state public health veterinarian for the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, on the recent New World Screwworm webinar. If you'd like to hear this full webinar or past webinars on New World Screwworm, you can find it by going to AgManager.info or following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but I would like to let you know that this will be our last show for this week, as we will not have one on Friday, July 3rd, but I will be back with you on Monday.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. For healthy tomato plant growth with maximum yields, tomato plants should be fertilized at planting and then several times throughout the growing season at very specific times. K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan discusses the timing of the 3 rounds of fertilizer. Matt, tomatoes probably the most popular thing to grow in Kansas, and the timing of nitrogen fertilizer applications is very important, not only throughout the season, but really at the beginning, right?
Yes, we want to make sure that when we're planting our tomatoes or any plant in the garden, we start out with a soil test to really understand the nutrient needs of our soil. Most tomato plants are going to prefer a soil pH of 6.2 to 6.8, and oftentimes in Kansas, our soils have a higher pH than that. And so being able to adjust the soil pH and the soil nutrients at planting is going to be the best and most effective time for applying our first fertilizer of the season. But as plants continue to grow throughout the season, we want to make sure that we fertilize tomatoes at critical times to really boost growth and production of our plants.
So we have the first fertilizer application, and then we wait a period of time and do a second application?
We do. We want to give that first fertilizer that we work into the soil at planting time to take effect. And usually by the time we start to see our tomatoes develop on the plant and reach their full size, usually while they're still green, that's typically the ideal time to put down our first follow-up fertilizer application of a nitrogen fertilizer. We usually want to wait about 1 to 2 weeks before the fruits ripen and turn red. But as they start to reach their full size, that's kind of our first cue to go ahead and do our second follow-up application of a nitrogen fertilizer in the garden.
And then there's actually a third round.
Yeah, so typically after the fruit of the first harvest have ripened and we've removed that first harvest from the plant, typically that's the best time for our next fertilizer application of our high nitrogen fertilizer. And then our third and final round is typically done about 1 month after that. So typically this is going to space our fertilizers out to be about once a month, depending on the weather conditions and how quickly our plant growth progresses.
So how do we make sure that we don't over-fertilize?
When we over-fertilize, we definitely can cause problems with our tomato plants. Too much of a good thing just causes excess growth and a lot of expense of fruit production. We actually minimize the number of tomatoes that our plants produce when we over-fertilize. So we really want to make sure that we are kind of calculating out the area that we're applying our fertilizer over and understanding the soil needs of our nutrients as well. Typically, when we are applying a high nitrogen fertilizer, something like ammonium sulfate, that's a 2100 fertilizer, ideally we're trying to do about a half a pound of that ammonium sulfate fertilizer over 30 feet of planting row. So that's about 1 cup of fertilizer per row. And depending on the fertilizer we use, we may use a little bit more than that or a little bit less than that, depending on the concentration of nitrogen in that fertilizer we pick, or how big or small that first number on the bag is. So there's a lot of varieties of fertilizer that we can use, lots of different brands and products. So it's always a good idea to read and follow the label instructions on the bag to know how much of that product you should be putting every 1,000 square feet or 100 square feet. You also want to make sure when checking out the label of your fertilizer that the fertilizer you use does not have any kind of weed killer or weed preventers in it, because those might have damaging effects on your tomato plants as well. If we are fertilizing our tomatoes, we want to make sure that we're eliminating as much weed competition around our tomatoes as well. Because we're fertilizing, the weeds love to be opportunistic and take advantage of that moisture and that soil nutrients there to try to grow. So this time of year, it's important to be adding mulches around the bases of our tomato plants. And that can be a wide variety of things, including straw, leaves, grass clippings. But we want to try to make sure we get anywhere from a 2 to 4 inch layer of mulch around the base and growing area of our tomato plants to really help reduce that weed competition and prevent weeds from trying to steal water from our plants as well. With our tomato plants, we're trying to really provide about 1 inch of water every week. And so we can easily measure that with a rain gauge that's stuck in the garden that catches our irrigation water from the hose or the sprinkler, however we're applying that water.
That's K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan with information on fertilizing tomato plants. To learn more, contact your local K-State Extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.